This is the Convene podcast. My name is Maggie, Digital Media Editor.
Welcome to another episode of the Convene Talk. Michelle, over to you. What are we discussing today?
Thanks, Maggie. I picked a story from BBC, which was titled Women in Tech Groups Can't Run on Inspiration Alone. And it was a little bit of a jump to kind of connect this directly with our industry, which is events. But there are definitely links to be made. So the story was about how Ada Lovelace Day, which is a global annual celebration of women working in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, is on borrowed time. And I've heard of this celebration, but I wasn't overly familiar with it. But it is named after a 19th century female mathematician. And it started in 2009. And it was created by Sue Charman Anderson, who had graduated with a science degree, but felt fundamentally unwelcome as one of just 3 women in her class. And she later grew tired of going to tech conferences. Bingo, there's the connection. And not seeing any women on stage. So she started the initiative, but it is now running out of funds, which happened 2 years ago. And she said they've kind of limped on since then. And the story went on to talk about how other kinds of initiatives that are focused on women in tech, including the charity Women Who Code, which is a group that had 145,000 members, announced in June that it was shutting down due to factors that have materially impacted our funding sources. This is a sad thing because we have written about how women-only conferences are really good things for women in order to advance and to have a community, particularly in a sector like technology where they are underrepresented. And it also ties into a story Barbara just wrote in our upcoming issue about the lack of funding and backlash against DEI initiatives. So Jen, I'm going to start off with you. Can you tell us how this kind of relates to your story that you just wrote?
Sure. This is Jen Dienst, senior editor. So this is a perfect example of something I wrote about for our next cover story in the September-October issue, which was all about networking. And I kind of honed in on specifically networking for women and why traditional networking doesn't really work for them, especially in women who are in traditionally male-dominated spaces like tech. And I found so much good research, interesting research around that. And I'll share one of them. So, for example, a lot of times people in these spaces, not just women in STEM, feel challenged by in-person social interactions. So networking spaces like these are integral for them to meet other people. And there was a randomized field experiment that the University of Minnesota did at an IT conference where women saw significantly less success in networking than men. And they hypothesized that 2 barriers were to blame. One, difficulty locating and meeting new people, which is kind of obvious when there's just not that many women around. Like, it's just going to be difficult to find other women. And social barriers that make interactions difficult. So they tested something out. They tested a few different things out. They basically formalized the networking process by connecting potential contacts via email beforehand and then introducing them. And it made a huge difference. They ended up being able, the time spent talking to new contacts jumped by 90%. Number of LinkedIn connections went up. Their odds of scoring a new job increased by a factor of 1.6%. So I think it really demonstrates that spaces like that, like Women Who Code, are really, really essential. Another example is the Female Quotient, their Equality Lounge, which actually got its start at CES 10 years ago. And Shelley Zalis, I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, actually started this whole movement there because she said, quote unquote, I was sick of feeling like the only and lonely in this space, which if anyone, I'm sure everyone listening knows what CES is and how big it is. And back then, there was a relatively small amount of women attending. So she started a movement and she asked other women to walk the show floor with her, just as, like, let's show people that we're here. Let's find each other. Let's connect. And now, 10 years later, it's a permanent fixture at the event. It's a lounge that is so big that actually I did an interview with Kinsey Fabrizio, the new and first female president of CTA. And she said that not only is that space thriving, it's expanding next year. And they have many, many, many other spaces that they've added, female-only spaces specifically for networking that they've added to that show experience. So I think those two things show just how integral and essential those kinds of spaces are for women to meet each other and grow their careers, because otherwise it's just really difficult to do so, just from the research and the people that I interviewed. Barbara, I would love to hear from you. I've talked too much.
No, that was great. That's a fascinating survey or experiment that they did. Hi, this is Barbara. I'm deputy editor. What I was thinking about in terms of this specific story is the emphasis on funding. And I think that it didn't say, when we look through the lens of events, I don't think that all of the events are going away. Some of the events are funded through the conferences and through, I know that like there are universities that are still having Ada Lovelace Day events. So I think when you look at the funding, the Women in the Workplace 2024 report came out this week, and it's been published, I think, 10 years. It's the 10-year anniversary. And one of the takeaways from that report is that even though gender parity is way off in the distance, I think they said 44 years, 22 years for white women. And then if you add in women of color, that stretches to 44 years. So gender parity is way off in the distance, but they said there were gains and there would be reason to be optimistic, except for this dramatic decrease in funding, which went from, I think, at 10 percentage points in 1 year, which is really huge. And I know that like in states like Texas and Wisconsin, there are anti-DEI laws where universities they can do research, but they can't do it. They can't make decisions based on gender. I think we're in this position where nobody knows what that means. The laws haven't really been tested. They're very new, but I think that's having a big impact. I think from the event standpoint, it is a tremendous opportunity, I think, for events to kind of step up and fill in this void and be creative. And I know in some technical-oriented industries, these initiatives started out with people just organizing lunch, where people said, here's the restaurant, we're all meeting there. And that's where it started. So I think it's an opportunity for events. And it's also in the larger picture. I know we've had this spate of anti-DEI laws and backlash here in the United States. It was news to me that this was also going on in the UK.
I actually saw another connection to the story that Michelle introduced in the beginning. Next week, actually, relative to when we record, it's in a couple of days, Climate Week in New York. And I was looking at the event and the sessions that they are already introducing, and there is a fascinating session, and it's called How Do We Close the Climate Girls Gap for a More Equitable Green Transition? So that's kind of curious, what do they mean by Climate Girls Gap? So I'll share the link also for everyone to read the full explanation. But basically what they mean is, and I'll just read from the article, they say the reality is that girls are most likely to be left behind in the green economy, despite being disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. The impact of climate change has the potential to push more girls out of school and affect their mental health, food security, and livelihoods, placing them at greater risk of child marriage, violence, and exploitation. At the same time, evidence shows that women leaders are affected in conversation and community resilient efforts. Yet women remain underrepresented in climate leadership, making up less than 25% participants in climate forums and national and international environmental sectors. We refer to this disparity as the climate girls gap, and closing this gap requires a few key strategies that they later on outline. I thought, it's not only in STEM, and we see it in other sectors, and that's a huge sector. It's very important, and I love the fact that they also touch on events, which is directly correlated to our industry. Michelle, what do you think?
I'm just going to go off on a little bit of a different tangent just because Maggie and I spoke about this earlier, that to go into the sustainability realm is sort of one of those unexpected knock-on results of climate change is child marriages are increasing in India because I know you wouldn't expect it, but they're finding they're on the increase in India because climate change is affecting a lot of the livelihoods of those people. So they're not able to eke out a living from farming or whatever their living is, which is usually agricultural based. And so in order to live, they are having their daughters marry earlier so that they're arranging them when they're 13 or even younger in order to receive funds. So it is, to Maggie's point, it is this unfortunate thing that women are, again, being the ones who have to bear the brunt of some of this climate change. Or it's not just women, it's minorities. And one really interesting podcast I've been listening to called Outrage and Optimism talked about how the hope is that Kamala Harris, if she is elected, as those of us on this call hope she is, what she will bring to climate change is a sense of climate justice because she's a prosecutor. I love this take on it. I didn't even think of it. She is a prosecutor who has prosecuted big fossil fuel companies when she was in California in her positions. And I just love that idea of climate justice being really part of the whole conversation because it is those people who are not able to mitigate the effects of climate change who are most affected. The underserved populations, people who live in geographic regions where their homes are being devastated by climate change, tend to be poorer populations. And I love that connection that she made. And I think that's a really smart way of thinking about it. Barbara.
Yeah, no, I think the word outrage really resonated. I talked earlier when we were looking at the Pcma's global report on women. And one of the big things that came out of that, I think, is just the opportunity for women to help women. In many countries, not, I think, in rural India, but in many countries, there are women now who have leadership positions. And there's so many studies about how effective women are as leaders. And I think that, it's like we're not going back. We're just not going back to where there's not opportunities for women to get education. There's not opportunities for women to feed their families. I just think that there's just too much commitment and energy among women, and that this will be an opportunity for women to just show their steely resolve to not let these programs go away. Even if they go away officially, they don't need to go away culturally and morally. So that's my little outrage speak. The word defiant came to mind.
I agree with you. And I had a little issue with the fact of, this women should help women. I thought of my first kind of reaction was, that sounds very feministic. I don't personally identify as a feminist, so I was like, don't know, maybe also men can lead the way. And I think that was also in the PCMA report, Barbara, that you mentioned earlier, saying that, yeah, men can also just give you a hand up and recognize you and your efforts. And yes, it's great to have female examples, for sure. But it's not only up to women to open up the ways forward. Casey, what do you think?
Thanks, Maggie. I agree. I know something that was brought up in the original article Michelle shared with us was that, a lot of people, politicians and people working in tech say, wow, these groups that you guys put together are amazing. What can we do to help? And when the founders say, well, you could give us some money to stay open, they say, oh, we were thinking more of volunteering. So, it's unfortunate that I think we've seen time and time again that when budgets are tight, the first things to go are sustainability initiatives and DEI initiatives. And everything we're talking about shows how essential these two topics are in incorporating them into events and into your organizations, but they're still sort of looked at as nice to haves instead of essential to have. And that's really what needs to change. It seems like many people still treat it as optional, and that's not really the case. Michelle? I agree it's budgets, but I think if you don't have the political will, then companies won't invest. I don't think it's a lack of funds necessarily. It's a lack of support. And if there is this political backlash, then they're trying to be all things to all people, and so they stop doing that. So that's the unfortunate thing. I think the two things are tied together. It's not so much economic as it partially economic, but also like where they're choosing to put their money and choosing to invest is not so popular now to do it with DEI initiatives. And that's the unfortunate thing.
I was just off of what Michelle just said about, well, guess what we were just talking about it being something that goes away, like funding for those types of things goes away rather easily. But it shouldn't be a fad, right? It shouldn't be the thing that, it shouldn't be the thing that gets cut. It's essential, I guess, or it should be thought of as essential. Cut some of your CEO salary instead. They get paid way too much because everybody else does their work for them, right? I'm just saying. The other thing I was going to say was that, and this might be kind of obvious, like having women in leadership positions helps educate men maybe who are in leadership positions who maybe do not believe that women can be their equals or can do the same job, and so, and also having women in leadership positions is always going to result in more women in leadership positions. So that's only going to help too for the funding of these groups or any of that kind of thing. So it's, but I just feel like it's really important with the, men should be also supportive of this, but since so many aren't, it's important that there are at least a few women who can show them, who can show them because they're their equals that, this is something you should be supporting all the way. And I just, it just seems so obvious to me. I just don't get it, but maybe I'm naive or something. I don't know. Barbara?
I was just thinking on the Claudia Golden, the Nobel laureate. I feel like she's an economics professor and researcher. And for me, she just dropped the mic on the question of women and their ability to lead when her research just shows that when women have children, then they tend to take jobs where they don't where they don't have to be on call all the time. And a lot of the top jobs, you have to be on call all the time. And her remedy, her suggestion was that jobs change and that there be childcare, that there be the recognition that, maybe there be job sharing, just ways that we can just look at that and say, this is how to get all this talent that women bring to the workplace, is to have more childcare. That was some of the recommendations in the report, that there be limits on how much women could travel, or ways that women could take their children. I know there's a lot of Christine Renaud, the founder of Brain Date, she's posted on LinkedIn about how wonderful it's been to take her children with her when she's come to San Francisco, and there's childcare available and she can spend time with them, and then they experience what she does and also, broaden their horizons. Casey, what are you thinking?
I'm glad you brought that up, Barbara, because it was just announced a few days ago that Amazon is ordering everyone back into the office 5 days a week starting in January. And I don't think enough is said about how much that hurts equality in the workplace, not just for women and men who have children at home that they need to take care of, but people who have financial barriers and can't get the childcare they need, people with disabilities who have a difficult time coming into the office, or chronic illnesses that keep them out of the office. It's such a disservice to all that talent. And I really worry on the tech side that it's going to start trending back in that direction. We're going to lose all that talent that was able to participate because of the more flexible work schedules.
I saw a great reel on Instagram related to that, on how all the generations would respond to this email in the workplace. It was hilarious. I'll probably just link it in the show notes for people to have some fun. It was very good.
I read that employees of Amazon went on social media to say this is the company's way of pushing them out, is their feeling.
I think it's like we need to trim, and here's a way to do it.
Yeah, according to the reel, that was the millennials' reaction to the news. And Gen Z were asking, what's an office? We have an office to go to.
Maggie, was the creator Champagne Cruise?
I have no idea now. Now I have to look it up.
While you're looking it up, I did I got an email just recently from Resume Templates, which surveyed 1,500 U.S. business leaders and their company's return to office strategy for 24 and 25. And 26% of companies have increased return to office days in 2024, and 12% plan to by the end of the year, and 9% will increase them by 2025. Of these companies, 1 in 3 will require employees to be in office 5 days per week. 1 in 10 companies are increasing RTO days to drive employees to quit, with half citing it as a strategy to avoid layoffs. So there's that. And this actually did sync with the results of our annual salary survey, where we found that more of our respondents said that they were required to work more days in the office, and they had specific days to work in the office rather than it being flexible as it was last year. Barbara?
I was just looking to see the Ada Lovelace Festival is something tied to Ada Lovelace Day. And it was I think sponsored by the University of Edinburgh. And it wasn't just women. It was like a festival for new ideas, new ways of doing things. It was tied to technology, but also tied to just kind of creating different cultures of support for people. So I thought that was really encouraging, that was something that seemed to me like it had evolved and had the male support that you were talking about, Maggie. that was very encouraging to me to see that.
On a positive note, if we're trying to end on a positive note, is that finally NASA's, did anyone else see this? The Black women who worked at NASA who were responsible for all of the incredible mathematical work that put us in space. There was a movie called Hidden Figures about them. They finally received the congressional, either them or their relatives received the congressional gold medal yesterday to acknowledge all of their incredible work.
Yay. That's really great.
Yeah, for sure. And I love the movie. And by the way, I also hope that maybe one effect of seeing those groups go away is that they're merging into the DNA of how things are done. I'm just being probably overly optimistic, but maybe that's why, because things have to merge, not divide, because there's also something that I believe is not optimal when we always divide into certain groups. Maybe that also hurts us in a way. So just something to think about. It's nice to have the support, but it's also nice to have the whole community support you. And on that note,
Or to be integrated, right? To be integrated into the community, right?
Exactly. So on that note, thank you, Owen, and thank you, Michelle, for bringing this topic up. As usual, you find all the article links and apparently reels this time in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, do give us a 5-star review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more industry insights, visit pcma.org/convene. And until next time.